Okay, hello. Um, Hi. It's very lovely to have you all here with us as a new semester begins and the Humanities Centre embarks upon another subject to explore and appreciate. Those of you who have been closely following our endeavours over the past 4 years will know that we dedicated 6 semesters to the theme of natural landscapes and human meaning before turning our attention last semester to the idea of home. Our focus this semester on silence seems to me a natural culmination of those previous undertakings. For with each of those landscapes, the desert most strikingly, we encountered an absence of human sound, a stillness, sometimes silence. And then what home promises us, among other things, of course, is peace and quiet, a refuge, ideally, from the jarring noise of the outside world. So we're going to look head on at the idea of silence this semester. And this is going to be a dominant element of this semester's programming at the Humanities Centre. Our exhibitions will explore this theme. Later this semester, we will exhibit a screening of Yvonne Rainier's silent dance piece Trio A, while right now, and curated by this afternoon's special guest, Derrick Cartwright, you can see on display some remarkable print works by the artist, composer, and writer John Cage. That will be augmented in March by a special concert performance of Cage's musical works, the product of a collaboration between the Humanities Centre and our wonderful colleagues in USD's Department of Music, Chris Adler, Ryan Nestor, Carissa Noble, and Christopher Apple. All of our events this semester, by the way, are detailed in our hot off the press calendar, and it literally is. Lindy and I were very agitated at the non-appearance of the calendar until yesterday. So it really is hot off the press. That is available at the front desk. So please take one of those and familiarize yourself with our programming. And of course, as part of that program, we have this, our regular Tuesday series. Starting today, speakers from a range of disciplines and with a range of perspectives will be examining multiple aspects and meanings of silence. There will, in fact, be an unprecedentedly large number of speakers in this series. We have 25 speakers in all, spread over 9 sessions, and they will consider the character and value of silence, what it is, what it adds to the human experience. And we'll also, of course, look at the flip side of that, the dangers, perhaps, of being silent in times such as these. It is a strange thing, but there's oddly a lot to talk about when it comes to silence. It is weird. This is the longest Tuesday series we've ever had, the Humanities series, oddly, about something you don't talk about. There's a lesson for academia, I suppose. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of those speakers in the series, and many of them are here, who have given their time and their expertise so freely and so graciously. And I need also to thank, as always, on occasions like these, all those people central to the smooth running of the Humanities Centre and its programming. Our element chairs, Susie Babka, Derrick Cartwright, Ron Kaufman, Catherine Statler, and Darby Vickers. Everyone's here. It's a full house. Cherry Diamzon, who's the Centre's gifted film assistant, Magdalene McRae, our splendid coordinator, Lindy Veer, miraculously gifted, knowledgeable, and competent assistant director of the centre, and my co-conspirators on the HC steering committee, Ron Kaufman and Noel Norton, who do so much and make everything lively and fun. And finally, I want to express gratitude to all of you who regularly attend and support our events and undertakings here at the Humanities Centre. By making, or by having these vibrant audiences such as this, made up of students, faculty, retired colleagues, administrative personnel, and our much appreciated members of the community, we can all show what a university is really about: the free exploration of ideas and the patient, careful reflection on human experience in all its variations and its continuity. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. It's lovely. It's a very lovely thing to start the year and see all these familiar and sometimes unfamiliar faces. Thank you for being here. So today's proceedings will progress something like this. I'm going to say a few words of orientation about the silence theme, and the lovely Derrick Cartwright will offer his thoughts. We will have a little period of Q&A after that. And when I say Q&A, we also just like reflections from people. It doesn't have to be, I have a question about this. It might just be a thought. And then I invite you all to join us for our traditional start of series reception, which is being set up right now. And this reception celebrates two things on this occasion. It, of course, marks the beginning of what we hope will be a fascinating series on silence. That's the first thing to celebrate. But, you know, as all of you in this room know, 2026 marks a very important anniversary, an anniversary of a truly world historical event, the 10-year anniversary of the founding of the Humanities Centre. Now, the real anniversary of our founding will be in October, but we'll start celebrating it today because, well, why not? Just checking we're all ever on. Yeah. Okay. I mentioned the desert earlier, and I want to start there. When I first went to Death Valley over a decade ago, I encountered something that I had never before experienced: a complete absence of sound. This was not the case constantly throughout that trip. There were bird calls, the howl of a coyote, the rustling of a creosote bush, and so on. But there was a single moment when I was walking with my sister and my brother-in-law, God bless him, towards a landmark called the Natural Bridge, which some of you may have seen. Our steps were crunching on the gravel, and then Bob, my brother-in-law, asked us to stop. And once the sound of our footsteps halted, we heard nothing. There was nothing at all. If anything, just the faint sound of the blood pumping in our ears, the faint internal sound of the body, but nothing else. As I said, I've never before or since experienced that level of silence, even when I am home alone in a lovely state of perceived quiet, without the television on, without music playing. There is always some sound, the humming of the fridge, say, the more or less distant sound of traffic, the background noises of the high-rise. The complete absence of sound in that one moment in the desert was something very different and perhaps even unnerving. I pause on that unnerving thing. Edmund Burke, we always talk about Edmund Burke, in his book on the sublime and beautiful, designated absolute silence as a type of privation, and accordingly as contributing to a sense of the sublime, with all the connotations of terror that such a sense has. Here's a line from Burke. All general privations are great because they are all terrible. And vacuity, darkness, solitude, and silence. Now, while that purest of silences may be unsettlingly sublime, the stillness of the desert, among other places, but the stillness of the desert offers plentiful opportunities for the kind of silent experiences which bring peace and solace. This situation is evocatively described, as always, by Edward Abbey, who, with good reason, we think about time and time again at the Humanities Centre. And I do promise I will be speaking about people other than Edward Abbey and Edmund Burke. This is not, I haven't become an AI. This is from the great book Desert Solitaire, about Abbey's first morning in the desert alone. The air is untroubled, and I become aware for the first time today of the immense silence in which I am lost. Not a silence so much as a great stillness, for there are a few sounds. The creak of some bird in a juniper tree, an eddy of wind which passes and fades like a sigh, the ticking of the watch on my wrist, slight noises which break the situation of absolute silence, but at the same time exaggerate my sense of the surrounding, overwhelming peace. A suspension of time, a continuous present. If I look at the small device strapped to my wrist, the numbers, even the sweeping second hand, seem meaningless, almost ridiculous. Now, this passage throws into relief the kind of silence that I want us to think about here. Not the total privation of sound that Burke talks about, but the absence of human sounds, the absence of the kind of noise characteristically produced by human beings. It is as a reprieve from the endless onslaught of human noisiness and declamation that silence is especially welcome, at least for a great many of us. Now, this is something that has been rather recently explored in an interesting book by Matthew Crawford. Here's Matthew Crawford, and this is the book where he talks about this, a book called The World Beyond Your Head. Matthew Crawford was a guest of the Humanities Centre a few years ago, and was a very interesting figure. Crawford begins by describing how the minutest pauses in our lives are now intruded upon, interrupted, principally by the forces, he thinks, of advertising. A hotel key card, the fold-up tray of your airline seat, the back of a grocery receipt, and more, much more. These have all become venues for advertising to you things that you never knew you wanted. Any blank thing, Crawford caustically remarks, is, and I quote, a gross offense against the efficient use of space. A gross offense against the efficient use of space. I like that sardonic phrase a lot. Just in passing, this reminds me of the historian Paul Fussell's concept of legible clothing. It is a bizarre thing, legible clothing. It means it's got right. It's a bizarre thing when you think about it, that our clothes now should habitually be festooned with words, especially perhaps when those words are advertising the store where that item was purchased. The ubiquitous Gap sweatshirt, for example. I remember the moment when I first saw this. I thought it was someone who worked at Gap and was on their lunch break. So I didn't understand why anyone would pay someone. But that's just an instance of that thing that Crawford is talking about. For some people, the plain article of clothing is a gross offense against the efficient use of space. I'm old enough to remember when soccer outfits didn't have adverts plastered all over them. It's a shocking thing when you think about it, how much words there are all over us. Anyway, Crawford makes the point that we are assaulted almost constantly by human noise. And it is the airport that he presents to us in this book as the perfect example of the competing worlds of silence and noise. The airport is a cacophony of noise, not just the constant stream of arguably useful flight and security announcements, but television screens blaring out news programs and adverts, music playing sometimes, and so on. Now, if one wants to escape from this, refuge can be found, though at a price. This is what Crawford says. Silence is now offered as a luxury good. In the business class lounge at Charles de Gaulle Airport, what you hear is the occasional tinkling of a spoon against china. There are no advertisements on the walls and no TVs. This silence, more than any other feature of the space, is what makes it feel genuinely luxurious. When you step inside and the automatic airtight doors whoosh shut behind you, the difference is nearly tactile, like slipping out of haircloth into satin. Your brow unfurrows itself. Your neck muscles relax. After 20 minutes, you no longer feel exhausted. The hassle lifts. I find this a remarkable passage. The fact that in this context, though, the fact that we have to pay for silence suggests that it's something of a valuable commodity, that it has become something scarce, something to be hunted for, once found to be protected, something available to people if they have the resources to have it, and so on. Now, I want to separate out a number of aspects of this value. Recall, first of all, that the silence I'm referring to is not absolute privation, not what John Milton means by those haunting words, silent as the moon. Rather, it is the sense of silence that Samuel Johnson captures in his definition of silence as, I quote, the state of holding peace. The state of holding peace. Restraint of speech, in other words, or lack of talkativeness. As Sarah Maitland reminds us in her lovely work, Book of Silence, this is a wonderful book, and it's a great picture of Sarah Maitland, who I adore. Maitland reminds us that the Oxford English Dictionary is ambiguous here, providing two very different definitions of silence. An absence of all noises, that's one definition of silence, an absence of all noises, and also an absence of speech. There are two different definitions. Maitland is appropriately funny, by the way, about the enterprise of investigating silence, such as what we're doing here. She says, that's very small at the bottom. She says, it is extremely difficult to talk about silence. At one level, this is so obvious as to be funny. Even writing a book about silence has a certain kind of inbuilt irony. Maitland actually ultimately rejects the idea of silence as a lack or an absence. It is, she thinks, a real, separate, actual thing. Anyway, that's a story for another time. It is that sense of silence as absence of speech that I largely want to focus on here. It is this sense that we find expressed in the book of Job. I quote, "Unto me men gave ear and waited and kept silence at my counsel." I'm thinking, therefore, of silence as it contrasts with language and talking. And the sheer amount of talking, the sheer amount of words, is often felt by us as something which shatters an often preferable peace. It is here, of course, that we arrive at that remarkable declaration made by Samuel Beckett that serves as a motif for this semester's investigation. Here's the gorgeous Samuel Beckett. And you've seen this if you have your calendar with you, you know the line. Every word is like an unnecessary stain on silence and nothingness. This is a very striking statement. And while few of us would wish to embrace that sentiment in its entirety, its extreme expression throws a stark light on the polluting character of the barrage of unnecessary words that sweep away silence. I want here just to gather together a number of different ways in which that idea has been articulated. First of all, one of the first artworks that the Humanities Centre bought for our permanent collection was this print, blah, 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 by the conceptual artist Mel Bochner. This is just one of a series of works by Bochner that repeated that phrase over and over again. Bochner said of these works that he was trying, in part, to throw light on the frequent inanity and meaninglessness of common human discourse. He said, and I quote, "It's about the emptiness, the endlessness, and the darkness of this discourse." This sentiment I find also voiced by the 18th century philosopher David Hume in a short piece of his on essay writing, where Hume bemoans the fact that our minds seem to be perpetually, and I quote, "stunned and worn out with endless chat." And then we have this headline in the satirical newspaper, The Onion, which to me now reads very much unlike a satirical newspaper. Report, only 3% of conversations actually need to happen. Now, imagine if we take this piece of humor seriously and hunt for the nugget of wisdom in it. There are things, of course, there are things that need to be said or should be said, things of great significance, importance, and beauty. But the currency of our language, the vehicle for those important thoughts, seem to be devalued by a flood of empty words and chatter. In a fascinating and neglected book on this topic called The World of Silence by the Swiss philosopher Max Picard, we find this idea pursued, and Picard does this with some quite remarkable imagery. He says, "There does not seem to be any space left where there could possibly have been anything but noise. It has," he says, "infiltrated into everything. Noise has infiltrated into everything. And our language is mostly just another species of noise. It penetrates us," he thinks. "It fills us up to the very brim. And then that noise seeks an escape, like we've been filled up with water. And then it overflows through our mouths." That's an extraordinary way of putting it, but his subsequent words, I think, are even more memorable. He says, "Nobody listens to him as he speaks, for listening is only possible when there is silence in man. Listening and silence belong together. Instead of truly speaking to others today, we are all waiting merely to unload onto others the words that have collected inside us. Speech has become a purely animal, excretive function." I find that incredible. It's like this is something that we like sweat. It's something that we just kind of excrete. That rather than a thoughtful, deliberative activity. Again, this is not to say that all language is like this. That kind of generalization, of course, has to be resisted. But does this not capture a very important feature of our experience of words? And how much more so in the age of generative AI, when words flow out effortlessly, really effortlessly from a machine and not even from a mind. words flowing without the preliminary operation of thought even. Now, if it is the case that there is an overuse of language, we might ask why this is so. Maybe it has something to do with our sense of pride at being, as we frequently call ourselves, the language-using animal, which is what makes us so distinctive. Now, as Darwin showed us in The Descent of Man, we're not the only species that communicates, far from it. But, and in Darwin's own words, and I quote, "The habitual use of articulate language is peculiar to human beings." Now, we are happy to have this defining feature. And as a result, we want to display it. Much like a nouveau riche businessman likes to display his wealth with ostentatious displays of gold, expensive wristwatches, high-end cars, and so on. Now, in the case of the businessman, we find this flaunting of wealth vulgar. It would be better if it was less showy, less brash, more subdued. So might we say the same about our use of language? Rather than flaunting it in extravagant ways, i.e. talking all the time, might the supreme value of words best be preserved by a certain kind of reserve in speaking, by talking or writing sparingly? Diamonds are precious indeed, but only because they are scarce. Now, it's in this context that we might admire those writers and artists who rationed out with great austerity words, language, and sound. The figure that comes to my mind here is the musician Mark Hollis, whose career from frontman in the 80s band Talk Talk through to his solo work and eventual retirement, obscurity, and barely noticed death was characterized by a slow and inexorable movement away from a wall of sound toward the exploration of space and quiet, and finally to utter silence. Interviews were a rarity for the very private Hollis, but in one of those rarities, he said this. He had a lovely face. Hollis said, "Before you play two notes, learn how to play one note, you know? And don't play one note unless you've got a reason to play it." This seems to me applicable not just to music, but to our use of language. Maybe we should be more reticent to talk unless we have a reason to do so. I need to emphasize again, this is not a blanket command or a resistance to talk per se. There are times, maybe many times, when we need to talk, but our words will have greater power, presumably, if they are not swallowed up in habitual, loquacious, endless utterance. Greater power if they are set in a generally laconic sea. This seems to be at work in Salvatore Rosa's self-portrait philosophy, which was brought to my attention by my good friend Tyler Hauer. The painting's Latin inscription may be translated as, "Be quiet, unless your speech be better than silence." Interesting that's associated with philosophy. And maybe we may detect in all of these writers and artists not merely a certain contempt for language or aspects of language, but a profound reverence for silence. And this takes two forms. Reverence for silence itself as something worth venerating, and silence as a proper response to that which is great, to that which should be reverenced. It will come as no surprise to those here who know me that I'm now going to mention Ludwig Wittgenstein. For Wittgenstein's early masterpiece, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, is an exercise in the sensibility of silence. Silence is indeed the last word in that remarkable book. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. Now, without going into enormous detail here, and I'm painting with a horribly broad brush, Wittgenstein had argued in the Tractatus that the function of language, a strictly delimited function, was to describe or picture possible or actual factual situations in the world. The cat is on the mat, to take the most banal example. That linguistic representation of a factual state of affairs is made possible by the way that words, as it were, reach out and make contact with the things or objects of the world. A word, Wittgenstein says, is like a label attached to a thing. Now, one consequence of this view is that language is restricted to the things of this world and to the most value-neutral things of this world. A great many of the things that we want to talk about, beauty, God, etc., are, on this view, to be banished from discourse. That's not to say that these things were unimportant to Wittgenstein, far from it. As Wittgenstein wrote to the publisher Ludwig von Vicker, trying to get him to see the point of the Tractatus, I wanted to write that my work consists of two parts, of the one which is here, the book, and of everything which I have not written. And precisely this second part is the important one. So you've got two books. One looks like a book with words in it, and then there's a blank book, because things you can't talk about. That's the important bit. The things you can't talk about is the important bit. The things we can talk about are largely unimportant for Wittgenstein, banal. Everything of significance lies beyond words, lies in the realm of the silent. Our words, he writes elsewhere, are vessels capable of containing and conveying meaning and sense, natural meaning and sense. They can express nothing that is higher. This, I repeat, is an attitude of reverence in the face of that which is higher, or that which is, to use another word, impenetrable. And I take that word impenetrable from Adolf Grabowski, fantastic photograph, who posited what he called silent reverence for the impenetrable. He said this, Grabowski said this was characteristic of an old, and of course now gone, conservative attitude, but his words are worth quoting. Not only is this reverence silent, but so also is that which is impenetrable. And thus our silent reverence is only a reflection of the great silence of all that is impenetrable. Now there's something religious or mystical in this sensibility. And they may bring to mind a well-known way of responding to the divine, hence from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, in the book of the prophet Habakkuk. That's a big font. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. That's the proper response to something divine and sublime. But I mean, regardless of one's own religious beliefs, one will recognize how silence, especially in a noisy, bustling world, may well be the proper and fitting response to those matters of utmost and sublime value. Now, in closing, I want to return for just one moment to Samuel Beckett. When Beckett was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1969, he was distressed that this spike in fame would disrupt his quiet and reclusive lifestyle. Beckett agreed to give an interview with Swedish television, but only on the condition that nobody would ask him questions and that he would not be required to talk. The result was, I believe, remarkable. And I want to thank Lindy for bringing this to my attention. And it's only a minute long. It's very powerful. This is what's known as Samuel Beckett's mute interview. Now it gives me great pleasure to say just a few words about Dr. Derrick Cartwright, Associate Professor of Art History here at USD and Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Timken Museum of Art. Professor Cartwright was educated at Berkeley, UCLA, and the University of Michigan, where he earned his PhD. He subsequently held a number of prestigious museum directorial positions, including at the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College and the Seattle Art Museum. Having taught at USD in the 1990s, he returned to us in 2012 to found and direct USD's system of galleries. He has curated exhibitions and lectured throughout the world about a variety of Anglo-American art and public art topics. Cartwright's publications include Robert Henry's California, Realism, Race and Region, Louis Gisbert, Loud Image, and an interlude in Giverny. Most recently, he has contributed 2 substantial chapters to the volume Wayne Thiebaud, his contributions are Punchlines, Anguish and Humor in Wayne Thiebaud's Life Work, and an extended interview with the artist conducted in 2012. Dr. Cartwright, most recently for us, has curated all of the Humanities Center's exhibitions. And his most recent exhibition is on display here, Quiet Vision, The Prince of John Cage. Please welcome Dr. Derrick Cartwright.
Thanks for being here, and thanks especially to Maggie, Lindy, and Brian for the invitation to speak. Let's see, I'll need the clicker.
Oh.
So I think any session on silence might naturally begin by considering John Cage's landmark book of essays that bear that title. It's a volume that since its publication in 1961 has reverberated through the common culture, revealing insights through its combination of aesthetic argument, personal memoir, experimental layouts, and radical freeform poetry. It's a strangely compelling and paradoxically noisy book. Indeed, silence marks the caesura between Cage's early scripted efforts and his fully mature concerns, which renounce predetermined formats, expected rhythms, and familiar harmonies. Except to quote from it on a couple of occasions, however, I won't have time today to mine anything like the depths of Cage's silence. Instead, I'd like to resituate the book's author within the adjacent frame of his art-making practices. Many of you, I think, will know already Cage's legendary contributions to music, his disregard for established composition and expected temporalities, his questioning the very nature of what might count as performance. But Cage's dedication to visual representations, while less known, are in fact more numerous. I realized over the last few months I'm trying to look more and more like John Cage. My point here is not to quibble over volume or output. Both as a musical innovator and as a maker of prints, Cage's remarkable polyvalence is the real subject of this short talk. By focusing on his substantial, understudied contributions to art history, I aim to fill out an appreciation for Cage that includes the installation of works behind me. In a now mostly forgotten profile published in November 1964, Calvin Tompkins laid out the cross-disciplinary stakes that shaped Cage's vanguard interests. Stripping away the hypno-speak of his time, the New Yorker's art critic asserted that, and this is a quote, Cage is proposing essentially the complete overthrow of the most basic assumptions of Western art since the Renaissance. End quote. Tompkins went on to clarify that, quote, the power of art to communicate ideas and emotions, to organize life into meaningful patterns, and to realize universal truth through self-expressed individuality are only three of the assumptions that Cage challenges. In their place, he proposes an art born of chance and indeterminacy, urging a perpetual process of artistic discovery in our daily lives. I think that assessment still rings true. It substantiates most judgments, including my own, of Cage's inestimable place within cultural practices of the last half of the 20th century, right up to our own moment. It's noteworthy that in the early 1960s, anyway, Tompkins grasped the connections between Cage's radical interventions in the fields of both music composition and public performance and some of the surrounding reigning ideas about image making. Abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock cultivated accidents and celebrated freedom from conventional decisions, not just in their application of paint to canvas, but in their fundamental renunciations of narrative in their works. In the same fashion, Tompkins observed Cage's experiments, suggested parallels to the absurdist theater of Samuel Beckett, already invoked by Brian. Quote, the main difference between Cage, Beckett, and the others like Robespierre, the critic calls them the radical empiricist, is that Cage is willing to go a great deal farther than they are in the direction of having art have no purpose at all. Tompkins' blunt estimation of his subject's status within urgent debates and spaces of his time strikes me as a good foundation, or as good as any upon which to build my remarks. The New Yorker profile addresses both the reach and the limitations of these ideas for an audience of mass market magazine readers who imagined their city's preeminence in all matters of culture. For my part, I want to challenge that presumed centrality in what follows, starting with Cage's own self-identification as an itinerant artist. Although he was living in Stony Point, New York, a kind of commune for artists located some 40 miles up the Hudson River from Manhattan at the time, this living situation was driven more by necessity than choice. Cage, who was born and raised in Los Angeles, inherited a small amount of money in early 1964 after his father's death, which enabled him to purchase half ownership in a duplex within an experimental architectural development known as the Lands. Manhattan real estate was out of his reach until much later in his career, and leading up to this moment, Cage had already lived in, and this is just a partial list, in LA, Pomona, a school he dropped out of in disgust, Paris, New York, Seattle, Asheville, North Carolina, Rome, and LA again. His romantic and professional partnership with Merce Cunningham, an enduring relationship about which Tompkins is notably silent, meant that he traveled ceaselessly with the Cunningham Dance Company, often conceptualizing music for their unconventional performances as they toured the globe. Before the Lands became his creative nest, Black Mountain College was the nearest thing to a permanent residence that Cage had known since he was a teenager. The experimental art school was a hotbed of creative energy, perennially in a state of economic distress. From 1933 to 1957, Black Mountain flourished as a refuge for Bauhaus faculty fleeing the rise of National Socialism in Europe and as a summer camp for abstract expressionists in the Great Smoky Mountains of Appalachia. racially desegregated and queer-friendly, Black Mountain College became understood in cultural circles as a place apart, a kind of Foucaultian heterotopia of sorts, where painters, architects, dancers, potters, and poets could congregate, live collectively, and without any regard for Cold War politics or civil unrest. Many students attended Black Mountain College thanks to the GI Bill. Many part-time faculty, Cage among them, were grateful for a place to indulge in radical practice without any academic surveillance or conventional restrictions, even if doing so sometimes meant going without the certainty of a paycheck. Cage and Cunningham participated in 3 summer sessions together at Black Mountain in 1948, 1952, and 1953, each of which had historic consequences. In 1948, Cage performed Eric Satie's work and denounced the influence of Beethoven in a memorable concert that incurred the lasting wrath of his mostly German hosts. For 4 years later, he was invited back. I think it's notable after 4 years, they waited to invite him back. That summer, he orchestrated a so-called theater piece with students like Bob Rauschenberg and fellow faculty like Buckminster Fuller and Willem de Kooning, contributed all to a cacophonous gathering, a Gesamtkunstwerk, which launched a wholly new genre of art making, the likes of which had not been seen in the United States before, the happening. In 1953, Cage served as musical director for a series of performances by Cunningham Dance Company, for which Rauschenberg designed all the sets, a creative partnership that actually extended for decades. It's in this context of spontaneous collaboration and encouraging interdisciplinarity, maybe it comes as little surprise that Cage started making his own art again while at Black Mountain. He actually made it younger in his career. The reciprocal experiments he shared with the 27-year-old Rauschenberg became sources of deep intrigue, conceptual kinship, and a lifelong friendship. Seeing Rauschenberg's first white and black paintings, Cage recognized these monochromes as fields for receiving a fundamentally different form of visual energy from any other canvas. Likening them to airports for dust, Cage understood these works as an invitation to a new kind of sensory experience. It can be also argued that Cage conceived of his landmark work, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, while at Black Mountain during the summer of 1952, while David Tudor's legendary first performance of that composition, where notably, he just sits at the piano and for the prescribed duration of the work, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and the sounds of the audience becoming progressively more upset. That's the music. That took place in Woodstock several months later. And there's no question in my mind of the shared sensibility between Rauschenberg's white paintings and the open staves that appear in Cage's sheet music. Both empty canvases and silent performance amount to occasions for a kind of perceptual alertness. This is what Brian was talking about, and random sounds, those dust motes that Cage would go on to celebrate in subsequent works. It's best to avoid a long digression here, but in another talk, I'd very much like to consider Cage's unconventional approach to musical notation as a form of drawing in its own right. If one looks at the ways in which the composer communicates to performers the elements of a work like Solo for Piano from Concert for Piano and Orchestra, which I'm showing you here on the right, it's easy to see why an artist like Jasper Johns might gravitate towards this particular piece of sheet music. And this is a drawing that actually belongs to Jasper Johns. Cage's openness to new strategies for directing musicians is akin to what became his extreme openness in accepting indeterminate forms in his print oeuvre. I think a source for this breakthrough can be traced back to Cage's intellectual embrace of chance works by Duchamp. And here I'm showing you Marcel Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages, which was created, some of you know this, by dropping a meter-long piece of string from a height of 1 meter and then translating the resulting shape onto contoured pieces of wood, then encased coffin-like in a wooden box. The visual interest of the resulting sculpture pales by comparison to Cage's elaborate handwritten notes guiding musicians, but both artists shared the view that open-ended variation could be a useful tool for producing sculpture or performing music. So this brings us to Cage's first print, a collaboration with Rauschenberg that took place in their shared summer at Black Mountain in 1952. In automobile tire print, Rauschenberg asked Cage to drive his aging Model A Ford, a vehicle that had already at that time been 20 years out of production, over a puddle of black paint and onto a sheaf of typewriter paper that he had taped together into a 22-foot long scroll. Looks like this. The irregular impression left by the tire's passage over this fragile surface, not unlike Duchamp's standard stoppage, was a conceptually rich, optically neutral event, a kind of tedious proof of being, an imbecilic fingerprint. Both Cage and Rauschenberg delighted in its realization, even as they disputed its authorship. Today, if you go to SF MoMA, it's displayed as a masterfully early achievement of Rauschenberg's genius, but Cage reminisced quizzically, which one of us drove the car? The disinterested guiding of a system that results in works freed from authorship, in this case driving, is a metaphor that operates for the next 4 decades within Cage's practice. So I need to move quickly now. In 1969, Cage was the composer in residence at the University of Cincinnati. News of Marcel Duchamp's death had reached him there. Not wanting to say anything about Marcel, that's the title of this work, communicates the artist's determination to remain silent about matters of personal influence while simultaneously offering a tribute to one of the most impactful figures in 20th century art. To create this multi-part print, he enlisted the assistance of a young graphic designer named Calvin Summerson, silkscreened Cage's randomly selected, sometimes fragmentary words and image shards onto 8 identical sheets of colored plexiglass, and by design, the arrangement of these semi-transparent sheets, like the bits of colorful text that appear upon them, have no specified order. Indeed, according to the artist, it's not even necessary to show them all at once. You can show as many as you like. While the title of the object, not wanting to say anything about Marcel, amounts to an auditory refusal, the work itself refers insistently to Duchamp's lasting impact on art history. Specifically, the vertical plates recall the French artist's notorious work, The Bride Stripped Bare by her bachelor's Even, a large plate glass structure that when it shattered in his studio, Duchamp famously declared, "Chance completed it for me." Without doubt, Cage's reliance on chance operations had become his standard operating procedure since at least the early 1950s, when he started employing an I Ching-inspired methodology to compose his music for changes. His idiosyncratic application of this ancient Chinese divination system to produce random events within a closed system was a result shared with Cage's growing interest in Zen Buddhism. As part of his Zen outlook, in which the self was untethered from illusion, Cage sought ever new means for avoiding any personal preferences and any established habits when making his art. The I Ching provided the tools to transfer responsibility for the appearance and sounds of a work to pure chance. Printmaking, as much as a musical composition or a notation, lent itself to this strategy. For example, the next series of prints that Cage undertook was a large portfolio of prints celebrating his twin obsessions with Henry David Thoreau and wild mushrooms. Made from 1971 to May 1972 and conceived as a collaborative portfolio, the Mushroom Book featured fragmentary texts by Cage and Thoreau arranged on a lithographic stone according to pure chance. Sorry, I'll show you. They often overlap with each other. These hand-scripted, densely patterned excerpts filled the sheet from edge to edge without regard for sequence or logic. Cage's texts, sometimes recipes for how to cook those mushrooms, were interspersed with highly detailed lithographic images of mushrooms, almost scientific illustrations by his collaborators, Long and Smith, to create the book. Cage evidently carried a basket full of mushrooms with him 5 years later when he accepted an invitation from Catherine Brown, the founder of Crown Point Press. Whoops, what did I do? Oh, so I don't want to show you that yet. Cage evidently carried this basket of mushrooms with him when he went to Crown Point Press in Oakland, beginning a 15-year partnership of printmaking in that space, which rivals, I think, almost any in American printmaking history. Ever patient, Brown catered to Cage's eccentric wishes in pursuit of chance and indeterminacy throughout all of those works. Ultimately, Cage pursued 14 different print series while working at Crown Point Press, but time is short and I have only enough time to share a couple more. Where R equals Ryoanji grew out of Cage's appreciation for Ryoanji, the 15th century Buddhist temple in northwest Kyoto. The narrow rectangular format of the etching plate was determined by the proportions, but not exactly, by the proportions of that temple's garden, which was created in the 16th century. That Zen space is distinguished by 15 large rocks grouped asymmetrically within its carefully groomed sandy surface. The marks seen in where R equals Ryoanji are not, however, an attempt to replicate the location of those famous forms. Instead, Cage relied once more on the I Ching to locate pebbles on a grid, which he then transferred to a copper plate, finally tracing those shapes with lines of varying intensity to create prints that look like this or like these. Brown deserves, I think, enormous credit for encouraging Cage's painstaking process and for her abiding patience. Beginning on January 2nd, 1983, Cage spent weeks working with Brown and Tyland Toland, the master printer at Crown Point, on this series, which continued for 2 years. All told, Cage made 170 drawings, which resulted in prints for this series, each one a little different from the next. And he continued to tour with Cunningham and lecture throughout the world at the same time. It's like one of the most mammoth printmaking projects in recent history. The images range in tonality from faintly visible to a dense, nearly solid black, all variations determined not by Cage, but by the system of indeterminacy on which he unflinchingly relied. When asked whether he would consider changing the results of an I Ching determined composition in hopes of creating something potentially more pleasing, the artist responded guilelessly, "No, I'll change myself instead." In 1985, Cage begins Ryoku, a series of 13 new etchings in which he continued to use outlines of flat rocks printed on handmade sheets of paper in random, disinterested patterns. The distribution and inking of the individual plates was also further determined by chance. In this way, although produced as part of an edition, the individual prints in Ryoku are in fact each unique. In naming the series Ryoku, Cage intended to combine the place name Ryoanji and the Japanese poetry form haiku. Let me go quickly. Though it's difficult to make it out in this particular side, this is a map which shows where he would place these eccentrically cut copper plates to rearrange this particular series of prints. The last print I'm going to discuss is also the most recent in this exhibition. It's called The Ready-Made Boomerang. It's a large work with a silkscreen text that follows another of Cage's chance-favoring, self-abnegating processes, the mesostic. A mesostic is a poem or a prose text arranged so that letters spell out a related theme, often a name, although here it's the title of the work, The Ready-Made Boomerang, which when read vertically or down the center of the spine of the work reveals this second subject. Cage began experimenting with this form very early in his career, perhaps as early as his days as an accompanist to dance performance at the Cornish School in Seattle, but later in life it became his preferred form of textual exposition. The Ready-Made Boomerang, which Cage produced in 1989 for the 8th Sydney Biennial, is a mystic emerging from a poem about improvisational music that he had written a year earlier. It's a found title, returning boomerang-like from a forgotten text. It's also a title that refers back to Duchamp, whose ready-mades transformed ideas about what could count as sculpture in modern art in ways that resembled Cage's strategies for finding music in commonplace experience. Just show you quickly, there's a Zostic written, one of 30, I think he did, with Marcel Duchamp as the title. But let's conclude by recalling that the prints gathered together in Quiet Vision behind me represent just the tiniest fraction of Cage's mighty visual output. His works have elsewhere been collected and celebrated through multiple, much larger interdisciplinary exhibitions in recent years, each of which has somehow seized on the idea of silence as its key principle. I hope that everyone who comes to the Humanities Center for the rich programming that's being offered this semester will take time to visit the adjacent gallery and take advantage of these subtle works. Cage once claimed for his visual experiments in print that they serve first and foremost to sober and quiet the mind. Let's all listen.